Come on outside. This is a father and son who own a secluded ranch house in the New Mexico desert, miles from anywhere. Police believe a fugitive is hiding inside their home, a man wanted for a severe and tragic crime days earlier. But what makes this situation so twisting is that the son is, in fact, hiding this man right under the police's noses, and the father is about to find out that his own son is protecting a fugitive inside the vents of his own home. How long can they keep this secret? Before we uncover the truth, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to support us. Now, let's get into the story. The night of the 24th of February was quiet in the small New Mexico town, the kind of silence that usually settles over the desert after the sun goes down. However, that silence was abruptly broken at the entrance of the local hospital. A vehicle, covered in the dust of the rural roads, sped toward the emergency bay with a sense of frantic urgency. It did not move with the calculated precision of an ambulance, but with the erratic, desperate speed of a driver who was either terrified or running out of time. The car came to a sudden halt near the sliding glass doors, the tires gripping the pavement harshly. Inside the vehicle, the situation was dire. The driver, a man whose identity was unknown to the hospital staff at that moment, scrambled out of the driver's seat. He did not wait for assistance or call out for a stretcher immediately. Instead, he rushed to the passenger side. He pulled a young woman from the seat. She was 26 years old, though in her current state, she appeared much smaller and more fragile. She was unconscious, her body limp as the man lifted her into his arms. The automatic doors parted, and the man carried her into the bright, sterile light of the hospital lobby. His movements were hurried, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding direct contact with the security guards or the receptionists. He was not behaving like a concerned relative or a worried partner. There was a shiftiness to his demeanor, a desire to be invisible in a moment that required total transparency. Nurses and medical staff, trained to react instantly to such arrivals, rushed forward to meet him. They saw the woman in his arms and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. She was unresponsive, her skin was pale, and she appeared to be suffering from extreme physical distress. "She needs help," the man said, his voice tight. He offered a quick, disjointed explanation to the approaching staff. He claimed that she was suffering from dehydration and that her kidneys were failing. He spoke of her condition as if it were a sudden medical illness, a natural decline in health that had simply happened to her. The medical team took the young woman, Sabrina, from him, placing her onto a gurney to rush her into a treatment room. As the weight of the patient left his arms, the man did not step forward to fill out paperwork. He did not ask if she would be okay. He did not sit in the waiting room wringing his hands in worry. Instead, he began to back away. "I have to go," he might have muttered, or perhaps he said nothing at all. The moment the staff's attention was fully focused on saving Sabrina's life, the man seized his opportunity. He turned and walked briskly back out the automatic doors, disappearing into the cool night air as quickly as he had arrived. He got back into his vehicle and drove away, leaving behind a mystery that would soon turn into a criminal investigation. Inside the emergency room, the atmosphere shifted from urgent care to suspicion. The doctors and nurses began their assessment of Sabrina. They had been told she was dehydrated, but as they examined her, the story the man had told began to unravel. It was true that she was in a critical state, barely clinging to life, but the causes were visible on her skin. She showed visible signs of trauma. These were not the accidental marks of a fall or symptoms of an internal illness. To the trained eyes of the medical professionals, these markings indicated severe mistreatment. It appeared she had been subjected to a violent altercation. The injuries were extensive, suggesting that this had not happened in a single moment but perhaps over a period of time. The doctor in charge looked at the nurses, a silent understanding passing between them. This was not a simple medical emergency. This was the result of a crime. The man who had dropped her off had not been a savior. He had likely been the one fleeing the consequences of his actions. "We need to contact the authorities," a staff member said, breaking the tension. Sabrina remained unconscious, unable to tell them who had done this to her or where she had come from. The hospital staff worked tirelessly to stabilize her, Her condition was incredibly poor. Her body was shutting down. The dehydration was severe, just as the man had said, but it was a symptom of neglect and mistreatment, not a natural occurrence. The nurses noted that she looked as though she had been through a harrowing ordeal, one that no person should ever have to endure. While the medical team fought for her life, the administrative staff attempted to piece together who she was. They had no identification from the man, and he had left no contact information. They had to rely on their own records and whatever information they could find on her person. Eventually, they managed to identify her as Sabrina Calderone. With a name, they could finally make the call that no parent ever wants to receive. They located the phone number for her father. The phone rang in a different house, miles away, waking a man who had no idea that his daughter was fighting for her breath in a hospital room. When the call connected, the staff asked him if he could shed any light on what had happened. They needed to know how she had ended up in such a condition. Her father was confused and horrified. He listened as the voice on the other end of the line explained that his daughter had been dropped off by an unidentified man. The father's mind raced. He knew his daughter, and he knew who she had been with. He told the police, who were now involved, that a man named Thomas Lopez had taken her. According to her father, Thomas had taken Sabrina from his home days earlier. The father claimed that Thomas had taken her against her will, using intimidation to force her to leave with him. He explained that Thomas had been keeping her at a location unknown to him, a place where she had reportedly been mistreated every single day since she was taken. The pieces of the puzzle began to click together for the investigators. The man who had dropped her off, the man who had acted so nervously, who had lied about her condition, who had fled into the night, was likely Thomas Lopez. Back in the hospital room, the machines beeped rhythmically, marking the seconds of a life that was fading. The police arrived at the hospital, hoping to speak to the victim, hoping she would wake up long enough to tell them where she had been and confirm the identity of the man who had hurt her. They needed a location. New Mexico was vast, with endless stretches of desert and isolated ranch houses. Without an address, Thomas Lopez could be anywhere, hiding in the emptiness of the landscape. The officers stood by her bedside, waiting. The investigation had officially begun, but they were starting with almost nothing. They had a name provided by her father, but they had no face to put to it yet, and they had no idea where the crime scene was. They needed Sabrina to wake up. They needed her to break the silence that the man had left behind. As the hours ticked by, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on everyone involved. The doctors were doing everything they could, but they were honest about her chances. She was too sick, her injuries too severe. The trauma her body had sustained was overwhelming. The focus shifted from hoping for a full recovery to hoping for a brief moment of consciousness, just enough time for justice to find its direction. The hospital staff moved quietly around the room, treating her with the dignity and care that she had clearly been denied in the days leading up to this moment. Outside the hospital walls, the night remained dark and cold, hiding the secrets of what had happened at a remote ranch house, a place that the police would soon come to know all too well. For now, the only person who knew the truth was the man speeding away in the darkness, and the woman lying silently in the hospital bed, holding the key to the entire case, locked within her memory. The atmosphere inside the hospital shifted from the frantic energy of an emergency admission to the heavy, sterile quiet of a crime scene investigation. Local law enforcement had arrived promptly after receiving the call from the concerned medical staff. 2 detectives stood near the entrance of the trauma room, their expressions grim as they observed the flurry of activity around the young woman. The initial assessment from the doctors was not optimistic. The injuries Sabrina had sustained were extensive, and her body was shutting down rapidly. The officers knew they were racing against time, not just to catch the perpetrator, but to get a statement from the only witness who knew exactly what had happened. They had already made contact with Sabrina's father via telephone, using the emergency contact information found in her records. The conversation had been brief but illuminating. Her father, shaken and terrified, had provided a name that would soon become the focal point of the entire investigation: Thomas Lopez. He had her locked up, the father had told them, his voice trembling over the line. He explained that Thomas had taken Sabrina against her will using a weapon from his own home days earlier, and had been holding her at a ranch house somewhere in the vast expanse of the New Mexico desert. The father's account was disturbing. He described a situation where his daughter was being mistreated daily. However, there was a significant problem for the detectives. The father did not know the specific address of this ranch. He knew only that Thomas moved from place to place, staying wherever he could, often living out of his car or in motels. Without a specific location, Thomas Lopez was just a name in a database, a ghost drifting through the county. The police knew that if Thomas had gone on the run immediately after dropping Sabrina off, it could be weeks or even months before they managed to track him down. They needed a lead, and they needed it immediately. The detectives looked toward the hospital bed. Sabrina was intubated and surrounded by monitors, her breathing shallow and irregular. The nurses were working desperately to stabilize her kidneys, which were failing due to severe dehydration and trauma. It seemed impossible that she would be able to help them. The lead detective felt a sinking sensation, fearing that the secret of Thomas's location would disappear with her. Then, a miracle happened. Amidst the beep of the monitors and the hushed commands of the medical team, Sabrina began to stir. Against all medical odds, she regained consciousness for a fleeting moment. It was as if she knew she had one final task to complete. The detective stepped closer, leaning in to hear her. Her voice was barely a whisper, weak and strained, but her mind was clear enough to understand the gravity of the moment. She looked at the officers, her eyes filled with pain but also a fierce determination. They asked her who had done this to her. "Thomas," she whispered, confirming the suspicions her father had raised. It was indeed Thomas Lopez who had inflicted these injuries upon her, but she did not stop there. Summoning every ounce of strength remaining in her failing body, she managed to speak again. This time, she gave them the one piece of information that her father could not: the exact address of the ranch where she had been held. The detectives wrote it down quickly, double-checking the location. It was a remote property, isolated and far from the main roads. Sabrina had just handed them the key to the investigation. She had identified her attacker and pointed the police directly to his doorstep. Moments after speaking those crucial words, Sabrina's strength gave out. She closed her eyes for the last time. The monitors flatlined, and despite the immediate efforts of the doctors to intervene, she passed away. The room fell silent. Sabrina had died, but in her final seconds, she had effectively solved her own murder. She had ensured that the man responsible would not be able to disappear into the anonymity of the desert. The mood among the officers shifted instantly from investigative curiosity to urgent action. This was now a homicide investigation. The suspect had a name, a location, and a head start. The detectives knew that Thomas Lopez was likely dangerous. The father had mentioned he took Sabrina at knife point, and the brutality of her injuries suggested a man capable of extreme violence. "We move now," the lead officer commanded. The police force mobilized with impressive speed. They gathered their teams, ensuring they were heavily armed and wearing protective gear. They were heading into the unknown, approaching a ranch house, miles from anywhere, potentially walking into an ambush. They had to assume that Thomas was still there, or at least that he had returned there after fleeing the hospital. They also had to consider the possibility that others were at the ranch who might be assisting him or who might also be in danger. The convoy of police vehicles sped out of the town and onto the dusty highways that cut through the landscape. As the city lights faded behind them, replaced by the encroaching darkness of the desert, the reality of the situation set in. They were approaching the address Sabrina had given them with sirens silent to avoid alerting the suspect too early. However, as they neared the property, a significant legal hurdle presented itself. In their rush to respond to Sabrina's dying declaration, the detectives had not yet had time to secure a search warrant from a judge. They had probable cause to suspect Thomas was there, but without a warrant, they had no legal right to forcibly enter the home unless there was an immediate, visible emergency occurring at that very second. They arrived at the perimeter of the ranch. The house stood quiet and dark against the night sky. It looked like a fortress of solitude. The officers exited their vehicles, taking cover behind their doors, weapons drawn but held low. They were stuck outside, feet away from where a brutal murderer could be hiding, yet legally paralyzed from kicking down the door. The lead officer looked at the house, frustration tightening his jaw. They would have to try to talk their way in. They would have to rely on the cooperation of whoever owned the house. If the residents refused to let them in, the police would be forced to wait outside while Thomas potentially destroyed evidence or found a way to escape. The final whisper of the victim had brought them this far. But now, the procedural complexities of the law stood between them and justice. The standoff at the ranch had begun. The convoy of police vehicles moved swiftly through the night, leaving the illuminated streets of the town far behind. They were heading deep into the New Mexico desert, navigating roads that turned from asphalt to dust and gravel. The destination was a remote ranch house, situated miles away from the nearest neighbor. It was the kind of place where a person could easily disappear, surrounded by nothing but scrub brush and the endless dark horizon. To the officers, the isolation of the property was both a blessing and a curse. It meant the suspect had few places to run, but it also meant the police were operating without immediate backup in a potentially volatile environment. As the headlights cut through the darkness, the officers felt the weight of the information they had just received. They were looking for Thomas Lopez, a man who had been identified by Sabrina in her final moments. The nature of the injuries she had sustained suggested that Thomas was capable of significant aggression, meaning the team had to be prepared for anything. They were heavily armed, wearing tactical gear, and ready to face a suspect who might have nothing left to lose. However, as the silhouette of the ranch house appeared in the distance, a complication arose that slowed their momentum. Despite the urgency of the situation and the dying declaration of the victim, the detectives had not yet secured a search warrant from a judge. This legal technicality created a precarious situation. Without a warrant, they had no authority to force their way into the home. They could not simply kick down the door and search the premises unless they were invited inside or unless an active emergency was visible from the exterior. The vehicles came to a halt a short distance from the property to avoid alerting anyone inside too soon. The officers exited their cars quietly, the gravel crunching softly under their boots. They approached the house on foot, moving like shadows against the fence line. They were stuck on the perimeter, knowing that just feet away, behind the walls of that silent house, a dangerous individual could be hiding. The frustration was palpable among the team. They were ready to act, but the law required them to pause. The house itself was dark, giving away no secrets. There was no movement in the windows, no sound of a struggle. It stood like a fortress in the desert, guarding whatever or whoever was inside. The lead officer knew they had to establish contact. They needed to draw the occupants out without escalating the situation into a standoff. "Ian, is that you?" one of the officers called out into the darkness, his voice firm but controlled. They knew the property belonged to a family, and their intelligence suggested a man named Ian lived there. "Ian, come to the front door for me." For a long, tense moment, there was no response. The wind blew across the open plains, whistling slightly past the eaves of the house. The officers tightened their grip on their equipment, eyes scanning every corner of the property for movement. Then, the front door creaked open. A figure emerged from the shadows of the doorway. It was a man, looking confused and perhaps a little defensive. This was Ian, the part owner of the ranch and a known friend of Thomas Lopez. Beside him, a dog trotted out, barking at the sudden intrusion of strangers in the night. "Hold on a second," the officer commanded, stepping into the light to make his presence known. "Who is it?" "It is the sheriff's office," the deputy announced clearly. "Let me see your hands." "Come outside. Let me see your hands." The instructions were repetitive and precise. The police needed to ensure that Ian was not armed and that he was not a threat to their safety. They also had to gauge his reaction. Was he surprised? Was he hiding something? "Is the dog okay, sir?" the officer asked, managing the scene to prevent the animal from becoming a problem while keeping his focus on Ian. "Hey, Rice, I got contact," another officer radioed to the team, confirming they had engaged with a resident. "I don't have nothing." Ian complied, raising his hands and stepping further onto the porch. He appeared cooperative, though his demeanor was hard to read in the dim light. "Okay, sit tight right here, man," the officer instructed him. The police knew that Ian was a crucial piece of this puzzle. Sabrina had told them about him before she passed, indicating that he might be vital to tracking Thomas down. However, the detectives were operating in a gray area. They did not know how much Ian knew about the incident that had cost Sabrina her life. They did not know if he was an innocent bystander or if he had played a role in what happened. They were aware that his house was the alleged scene of the crime, which meant he was, at the very least, a witness to the events. "Who is all here, man?" the officer asked, trying to get a head count to ensure officer safety. "My father," Ian replied, his voice somewhat shaky. My friend Bugsy." "What is Bugsy's real name?" the officer pressed. "I don't know," Ian admitted, or perhaps feigned ignorance. The officers exchanged glances. The presence of multiple people complicated the tactical approach. They had to clear the house to ensure no one was in danger and to look for Thomas, but they had to do so carefully. They could not assume Ian was telling the whole truth. "Come on outside," the officer directed him, moving him away from the door to create a safe distance. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The interaction was polite, but carried an undercurrent of steel. The police were probing for information, looking for any sign of deception. They asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Is Thomas staying out here? Or has he been out here?" the officer asked directly. Ian hesitated slightly before answering. "Been out here a few times," he said, offering a vague response that neither confirmed nor denied Thomas's current presence. "Is there anybody else inside?" the officer asked again. "You said Bugsy. If I can go with you to the door, can you call her outside?" "Yeah, okay. Let me go get her," Ian said, turning to go back inside. "Yeah, well, just call her from the door, please," the officer corrected him quickly. They were not about to let Ian go back into the house unescorted, where he could potentially warn Thomas or destroy evidence. The tension at the ranch was palpable. The police had successfully made contact, but they were still stuck on the outside looking in. They had a cooperative but vague homeowner, a mention of a mysterious guest named Bugsy, and a dark house that could be hiding a desperate man. The officers knew they had to tread carefully. They needed to get everyone out of the house to secure the scene, all while waiting for the legal authorization to search the property thoroughly. The game of patience had begun, and the police were determined not to let any mistakes jeopardize the case. The standoff at the front of the ranch house continued under the cold desert sky. The police had successfully called Ian out from the shadows, but they knew the property was not yet secure. The lead officer signaled for the remaining occupants to exit the home. Moments later, an older man stepped onto the porch, squinting against the glare of the police flashlights. This was Perry, Ian's father and the owner of the property. Perry moved with the weary resignation of a man who was tired of the chaos that seemed to follow his son. He did not appear frightened by the police presence. Instead, he looked exhausted and frustrated. As he walked down the steps to join Ian in the yard, the contrast between the two men became immediately apparent to the detectives. Perry walked with an air of transparency, his hands open and his posture relaxed, suggesting he had nothing to hide. Ian, however, remained stiff and anxious, his eyes darting back toward the house he had just exited. The officers separated the two men slightly to gauge their reactions. They needed to explain why a heavily armed unit was standing in their driveway in the middle of the night. The lead deputy spoke to Perry first, keeping his tone professional but serious. He explained that there had been a severe incident involving a young woman named Sabrina, and that the investigation had led them directly to this ranch. Perry listened intently, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern. When the officer mentioned Thomas Lopez, a flicker of recognition crossed Perry's face. He did not deny knowing the man. In fact, he was quite candid about his feelings toward his son's guest. Perry admitted that Thomas had been staying at the ranch for a few days and that he had caused nothing but trouble. He told the officers that he did not care for Thomas and was aware that the man had gotten himself into some serious situations recently. The detective pressed further, asking if Perry had witnessed anything unusual in the past few days. Perry's answer was chilling in its honesty. He revealed that he had indeed heard a commotion. He described hearing shouting and the sounds of a physical altercation coming from the other side of the wall. He had heard a woman's voice pleading for help, but amidst the frequent traffic of people coming and going from Ian's part of the house, he had not intervened directly, perhaps underestimating the severity of what was happening. "I am trying to make things right," Perry told the officer, his voice tinged with regret. He apologized for his son's choices and the company he kept, unaware that the situation was far worse than a simple domestic dispute. Perry believed that the woman involved had already left the property and gone to the hospital days ago, assuming the drama was over. He had no idea that the police were there, investigating a fatality. While Perry was open and cooperative, Ian stood nearby, saying almost nothing. The detectives observed him closely. They noticed that Ian kept glancing toward his father, and then back at the house, a nervous tic that betrayed his internal panic. It was as if he was terrified that his father might say too much, or perhaps he was worried that the police would go back inside. The officers sensed that Ian was holding a heavy secret. They knew from experience that silence often spoke louder than words. The police explained to Perry that due to the severity of the crime, a woman had lost her life. They needed to secure the house. They informed him that they were in the process of obtaining a search warrant to go through the property thoroughly for evidence. However, for the safety of the officers and the residents, they needed to conduct a protective sweep immediately to ensure no other aggressive individuals were hiding inside. Perry, believing the house to be empty of threats, nodded his consent. He told them they could look anywhere they needed to. He even offered to take them on a tour of the barns and the outbuildings, eager to prove that he was not harboring a fugitive. "I am not looking for anything except to just make sure there is nobody inside," the officer assured him, preparing to enter. This moment was the turning point. Perry's cooperation trapped Ian. If Ian protested the search now, he would look incredibly suspicious in front of his father and the police. He had to remain silent and play the role of the innocent roommate, all while knowing that Thomas Lopez was still inside the building. Ian had helped Thomas hide just hours earlier, tucking him away into a space where he hoped the police would not look. The officers prepared to enter the home, their hands resting near their holsters. They asked Ian to walk with them, a tactical move to keep him close and to see how he reacted as they moved through the rooms. "You mind if I walk inside with you just so we can make sure there is nobody else inside?" the officer asked Ian. Ian, cornered by circumstance, forced a casual demeanor. "Sure," he replied, though the tension in his shoulders remained high. He knew that the police were about to walk right past the secret he was keeping. The father believed the house was safe, the son knew it was a hiding place for a killer, and the police were stepping across the threshold to find out who was right. The dynamic between the two family members was fractured by the lie Ian was maintaining, a lie that was about to be tested by the flashlights of the sheriff's department. The tension that now gripped the ranch had been building long before the police lights cut through the darkness. To understand why Ian stood frozen on the porch while his father offered a tour of the property, one had to look back at the days leading up to this moment. The ranch had become a sanctuary for the wrong kind of people, a fact that weighed heavily on Perry. He had watched a parade of his son's acquaintances drift in and out of their lives, treating the isolated home like a way station where the rules of the outside world did not apply. Thomas Lopez was the latest addition to this roster, and his presence had shifted the atmosphere in the house from chaotic to dangerous. Thomas had arrived a few days earlier, needing a place to stay because he had nowhere else to go. He was a man constantly on the move, jumping from one location to another to avoid the consequences of his actions. Ian, driven by a misguided sense of loyalty or perhaps a fear of saying no, had opened the door and let him in. From the safety of his own bedroom, Perry had listened to the deterioration of peace within his home. The walls of the ranch house were thin, and they did little to block out the sounds of the volatile relationship Thomas had brought with him. Perry was not a man who looked for trouble, so he often stayed behind his closed door, hoping the storms in the living room would pass. However, the noises he heard were impossible to ignore. He heard the distinct sounds of aggression. There were raised voices, the thud of physical contact, and the crying of a woman. It was a repetitive cycle of shouting and pleading that echoed through the hallway. Perry knew exactly what was happening. He could hear the violence in the tone of the voices. On one occasion, the disturbance was so loud that Perry felt compelled to intervene, or at least to acknowledge it. He had peered out of his room, unable to stay silent, while a guest in his house caused such distress. Ian had been the gatekeeper in that moment. When Perry questioned the noise, Ian had been the one to smooth things over. He had told his father that he handled it, urging him to go back inside and leave it alone. Ian was trying to manage a situation that was spiraling out of his control. He acted as a buffer between his father's desire for a peaceful home and Thomas's volatile behavior. Ian wanted to maintain his reputation with his friends, a desire that forced him to compromise his own morals. There was a specific conversation that haunted the house. Ian had confronted Thomas during one of the arguments. He had walked into the kitchen area where Thomas and Sabrina were screaming at each other. Ian asked them what was going on, trying to de-escalate the noise level. Thomas, despite the obvious distress of the woman beside him, had simply brushed it off. He told Ian that they were fine, that it was just a disagreement. Ian, seeing Sabrina crying but hearing Thomas's dismissal, chose the path of least resistance. He accepted the lie because it was easier than challenging a man like Thomas. He went back to his room, leaving them to their darkness. This willful ignorance was the foundation of the current crisis. Ian had established a rule for his friends. They did not come to his house for simple problems. He expected them to handle their own business. Yet, by allowing Thomas to stay, Ian had invited a level of trouble that went far beyond simple drama. He had allowed a predator to live under the same roof as his unsuspecting father. As the days passed, the violence escalated until the night Sabrina was taken away. Perry had seen the aftermath, or at least a part of it. He knew she had been taken to the hospital, and he assumed that was the end of it. He believed that once she was gone, the problem was solved. He did not know that Thomas had returned. He did not know that after dropping Sabrina at the emergency room, Thomas had fled right back to the sanctuary Ian provided. This was the secret that tightened Ian's chest as he stood before the police. He knew that Thomas was not gone. Just hours before the officers arrived, Ian had made a critical decision. When he realized that the law might come looking for his friend, he did not tell Thomas to leave. Instead, he helped him. They had worked together in a panic to remove a vent cover in the floor. Ian had watched as Thomas lowered himself into the cramped, dusty ductwork beneath the house. Ian had placed the cover back over the opening, effectively sealing the secret beneath the floorboards. He had chosen his side. Now, as the police prepared to enter, Ian was forced to maintain the charade. He had to act as though he was just as confused as his father, all while knowing that the man responsible for the tragedy was lying in the darkness, just inches beneath their feet, listening to every word they said. The uninvited guest was no longer just in the house. He had become a part of it, and Ian was the only one who held the map to his location. The air inside the ranch house was stale, carrying the scent of dust and tension. The police officer stepped across the threshold, his boots heavy on the floorboards. Ian walked beside him, his movements stiff and unnatural. The officer was not there to conduct a full forensic search just yet. His immediate goal was to clear the building of people to ensure the safety of his team. He needed to make sure that no one was waiting in the corners with a weapon. They moved through the living area, which was cluttered with the debris of daily life. The officer kept his hand near his holster, his eyes scanning every shadow. Ian was acting as a reluctant guide, nodding toward rooms while trying to keep his eyes away from the floor vents. He knew what lay beneath them, and the fear of discovery made it hard for him to breathe. As they approached one of the back bedrooms, the officer noticed something on the bed. It was a pile of blankets, but the shape was irregular. It did not look like an unmade bed. It looked like someone was hiding. "Hey," the officer called out, his voice cutting through the silence of the house. "I am right here. Come back here." He moved closer to the bed, keeping his distance to react to any sudden movements. "You under the covers," he commanded firmly. "Let me see your hands. What is up? Let me see your hands." The lump under the blankets shifted. Slowly, a hand emerged, followed by a head. It was not the man they were looking for. It was a woman, looking disheveled and terrified. The officer relaxed his stance slightly, realizing that this was not Thomas Lopez, but he did not lower his guard completely. "It is not a guy," the officer called out to his partner who was waiting near the entrance. "Okay, right. Ma'am, coming with us." The woman looked confused, blinking in the harsh light of the officer's flashlight. She seemed unsure of why she was being woken up or why the police were in the room. "You are looking for?" she started to ask, her voice trailing off. "No, she is fine," the officer said to his colleagues, confirming she was not the threat. "We are looking for a dude. We are not looking for her. But ma'am, we do need to ask that you come outside with us." The woman, who would later identify herself as Bugsy, climbed out of the bed. She was another drifter in the orbit of Ian's chaotic life. She had been staying at the house, using it as a temporary shelter, much like Thomas had. The police escorted her out of the house and into the cool night air, separating her from Ian immediately. This was a standard tactic. They wanted to hear her story before she had a chance to coordinate a lie with the homeowner. Once outside, the detectives began to question her. They needed to know what she had seen and how long she had been there. If she had been in the house during the last few days, she might have been a witness to the violence that claimed Sabrina's life. "I just got there today to do some laundry," Bugsy told them quickly, her voice rising in defense. It was a convenient explanation, one that placed her far away from the timeline of the crime. She claimed she was just passing through, using the facilities because she had nowhere else to wash her clothes. She insisted she knew nothing about any arguments, fights, or injured women. The detectives listened to her denial with skepticism. It was common for people in these situations to feign ignorance to avoid getting involved in a murder investigation. However, they did not press her too hard in the first moments. They kept her on the scene, treating her as a witness rather than a suspect. "I did not see none of that," she repeated, shaking her head. "Did you hear any of it?" the officer asked. "I did not," she replied firmly. Despite her denial, the police found her presence useful. She confirmed that the house was a revolving door of guests, validating the idea that Thomas could have easily been there without raising suspicion from the outside world. They decided to keep her close. Even if she claimed to be blind to the events, her presence in the house meant she might know Thomas's habits or his potential hiding spots. Meanwhile, inside the house, the initial sweep concluded. The officer walked back out to update the team. The house appeared empty of threats on the surface level. They had found Bugsy, but there was no sign of Thomas in the main rooms. Ian let out a breath he had been holding, thinking the danger of discovery had passed. He did not realize that finding Bugsy was just the first step. The police were methodical, and while Bugsy claimed she was just there for the laundry, her existence proved that Ian was not the only one keeping secrets in the desert fortress. The circle was tightening, and the search was far from over. The officer signaled for Ian to follow him as they continued deeper into the residence. The initial discovery of the woman in the back room had put the law enforcement team on high alert, but now they needed to ensure that no other individuals were concealing themselves in the remaining spaces. The officer moved with a tactical precision, his flashlight cutting through the dim interior as he checked behind doors and inside closets. He was not conducting a forensic examination of the property yet. That would require the official paperwork to be signed and delivered. For now, his primary objective was to neutralize any potential threats to his team. Ian walked a few paces behind the deputy, his hands still visible as instructed. He struggled to maintain a facade of calm. Every time the heavy boots of the officer thudded against the floorboards, Ian felt a spike of panic. He knew exactly where Thomas was hiding. The fugitive was not in a closet or behind a shower curtain. He was tucked away in the narrow, dusty darkness of the ventilation system that ran beneath the very floor they were walking on. Ian had to resist the urge to look down or to steer the officer away from specific areas of the hallway where the metal grates were located. The officer swept through the kitchen and the living area. The house was cluttered, filled with the accumulation of daily life, which made the search difficult. There were too many places where a person could crouch down and hide. The deputy checked the bathroom, pulling back the curtain to reveal an empty tub. He checked the pantry and the spaces behind the furniture. With every room that was cleared, The officer grew more confident that the house was secure, yet the feeling of unease remained. The intelligence they had received from the hospital was specific, and the behavior of the son was suspicious. After checking the final bedroom and finding it empty, the officer turned to Ian. He informed him that the interior sweep was complete for the moment. To the naked eye, the house appeared to be free of Thomas Lopez. Ian nodded, offering a weak confirmation that he lived alone with his father and the occasional guest. He hoped that this would be the end of it, that the police would accept the empty rooms as proof of his innocence and leave the property. They exited the house, returning to the cool night air, where Perry and the other officers were waiting. The lead detective updated the team, stating that the residence was clear of visible threats. However, the investigation was far from over. The lead officer approached Perry to explain the next steps. He told the father that due to the gravity of the situation, the investigators were applying for a warrant that would cover the entire property. This meant they intended to search not just the house, but the barns, the vehicles, and the surrounding land. Perry, still eager to prove that he had nothing to hide, tried to be helpful. He told the officers that the well house was locked, but the barn was unlocked. He offered to take them on a tour right then and there, suggesting they could look through the outbuildings immediately to save time. He was convinced that if Thomas was on the property, he would be hiding in one of the external structures, away from the main house. Perry reasoned that he did not think Thomas was there, but he wanted to clear his name and his property of any suspicion. The officer declined the offer politely but firmly. He explained to Perry that they needed to do everything by the books. If they searched the barn now based solely on permission, a defense lawyer could later argue that the search was illegal or coerced. The officer wanted to ensure that any evidence they found would stand up in court. He told Perry that they would wait for the paperwork to be finalized before they opened any more doors. This decision to wait added a new layer of tension to the standoff. It meant that the police were not leaving. They were going to hold the perimeter and wait for the judge to sign the warrant. For Ian, this was a nightmare scenario. It meant that Thomas was trapped beneath the floor with no way to escape. The longer the police stayed, the more likely it was that Thomas would make a noise, or that the dogs would pick up a scent, or that the police would think to look in the less obvious places. The officers set up a secure line around the house. They watched the windows and the doors, ensuring that no one went in or out. The search had officially begun, but for the next few hours, it would be a game of waiting. The police knew someone was lying, and they were prepared to wait as long as it took to uncover the truth. The house stood silent, but the pressure on the secret hiding within its walls was beginning to become unbearable. While the police held the perimeter at the ranch, a separate team of investigators followed a lead regarding Thomas's recent history. They arrived at a different residence, the home of a woman named Monique, another associate of the suspect. The officers hoped to find Thomas there, or at least gather information about his behavior. Instead, they found a situation that mirrored the control he had exerted elsewhere. The people at the residence revealed that Monique was not home. She had gone to a rehabilitation center and was currently staying away from the property. However, the details they provided painted a disturbing picture of Thomas's actions. A witness explained to the police that Thomas had taken Monique's phone, effectively cutting off her communication with the outside world. Even more alarming, the witness stated that Thomas had changed the locks on Monique's house, taking possession of her home while she was vulnerable. The witness told the officers that they had been forced to change the locks back because Monique was terrified of him. He was a serial offender who targeted vulnerable individuals, isolated them, and took over their spaces. The officers searched the house and the attic, but Thomas was not there. This confirmation sent the focus of the entire investigation crashing back to the ranch house. Thomas had nowhere else to go. He had burned his bridges and frightened his associates, leaving the ranch as his only remaining sanctuary. Back at the station, the detectives brought Ian into an interview room. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken truths. Ian sat in the chair, still unaware of the full extent of the tragedy. The detective began by asking him simple questions, trying to establish a baseline. Ian admitted that he had heard an altercation between Thomas and Sabrina a day or so prior. He described hearing screaming coming from the kitchen area, but claimed he did not see anything physical. Ian explained that he had checked on them, asking if they were okay, and Thomas had dismissed him, saying they were fine. Ian had accepted this, not wanting to get involved in their drama. The detective then shifted the tone of the conversation. He looked at Ian and revealed the devastating news that Sabrina had passed away from her injuries. The revelation hit Ian hard. The detective reminded Ian that he had been told previously that the police did not come out to the ranch for simple matters. This was now a homicide investigation. The officer pressed Ian, explaining that Sabrina had told them she was beaten at his house. The pressure mounted as the detective made it clear that Ian was facing a choice: protect a man who had taken a life, or help the police ensure safety and justice. Ian began to realize that his silence was no longer just about being a good friend. It was about being an accomplice to a catastrophe. The detective presented Ian with an ultimatum. He asked Ian directly where Thomas would hide if the police were coming for him. Ian hesitated, wrestling with his fear of Thomas and his fear of the law. He knew that the cameras were rolling and that his community would see him cooperating. But the gravity of the murder charge outweighed the code of silence he tried to live by. Ian finally broke. He asked for the cameras to be turned off, a request the police could not fully grant in spirit, but they listened intently. Ian confessed that Thomas was indeed at the house. He was not in a closet or a shed. Ian revealed that Thomas was hiding inside the ventilation system of the home. He explained the mechanics of the hiding spot. Ian admitted that he had helped Thomas enter the vents and then placed the vent cover back on from the outside. This detail was crucial because it confirmed that Thomas could not have done it alone. He had assistance. The police now knew exactly where their suspect was. He was trapped beneath the floorboards, a known killer lying in wait in the dark, narrow tunnels of the house's heating system. The information from the interrogation room was immediately relayed to the team at the ranch. The officers looked at the house with new eyes. It was no longer just a building. It was a labyrinth. They analyzed the layout of the ventilation system. One officer noted that there was a large hallway vent that was the only one big enough for an adult male to enter. They deduced that if Thomas had entered through the hallway, he would have had to crawl past several junction points. The officers realized the tactical danger of the situation. To get to the vent, they would have to clear 2 rooms and a hallway, exposing themselves to a suspect who might be armed and was certainly desperate. The team formulated a plan. They could not simply crawl in after him. The space was too tight, and it would put the officers at a fatal disadvantage. They decided to use technology to confirm his location before making physical contact. They prepared mirrors and flashlights, turning the search into a methodical operation to trap the suspect within his own hiding spot. The officers re-entered the house, moving silently toward the hallway vent Ian had identified. They removed the cover and peered into the darkness. At first, there was only silence. One officer called out, announcing himself as the sheriff's office and ordering Thomas to come out. There was no response. They improvised a surveillance tool, taping a phone and a flashlight together to see deep into the ductwork. As they angled the light down the shaft, the camera caught an image. They could see the back of a neck and a jacket. Thomas was there. He was lying still, refusing to acknowledge the police presence just feet away from him. The officers continued to call out to him, urging him to surrender. They told him they had seen him in the pictures and knew he was there. Still, Thomas remained silent. He did not shuffle or move. The officers began to worry about his condition, fearing he might have harmed himself or lost consciousness. But they maintained their distance, refusing to enter the trap. Hours had passed, and the standoff remained unresolved. The police needed to extract Thomas without endangering their officers. A deputy came up with a strategy to force him out using chemical agents. They discussed introducing pepper spray or a fogger into the ventilation system. The plan was to spray the irritant into one end of the vents to push him toward the exit, or to spray it from both sides to make the environment unbearable. The officers knew that the gas would fill the confined space rapidly, causing coughing and difficulty breathing. It was a severe tactic, but they were dealing with a murder suspect who refused to comply. They prepared the canisters, positioning themselves to deploy the gas and catch Thomas when he inevitably fled the fumes. Before the police could deploy the gas, The psychological pressure finally broke Thomas's resolve. Hearing the officers discuss the plan and realizing there was no escape, Thomas called out from the darkness. He asked them what he had done, feigning ignorance. The officers told him to come out, assuring him that nobody would hurt him if he surrendered. Thomas crawled out of the vent, covered in dust and dirt. He was handcuffed immediately. In the subsequent interview, Thomas attempted to fabricate a story to explain Sabrina's injuries. He claimed they had only argued and that he had never hit her. He told the detectives that they had been in the barn and she had lost her footing on the stairs, falling from the top to the bottom. He described the stairs as having large gaps and being poorly constructed, blaming the architecture for her death rather than his own actions. He claimed he had picked her up and helped her to the house, acting as a caretaker rather than an abuser. His story was a desperate attempt to cover up a brutal crime with a tale of an accidental fall. But he did not know that the police had already spoken to Sabrina. The final chapter of the saga played out in the courtroom. Thomas's story about the stairs fell apart completely under scrutiny. The prosecution presented the dying declaration of Sabrina Calderon. She had woken up in the hospital just long enough to tell the truth. She refuted the claim of an accident, stating clearly that Thomas had physically assaulted her repeatedly. Furthermore, she revealed that he had used a blunt object to harm her and had kept her restrained in the barn for a significant amount of time. She described a month-long ordeal of being held against her will, far different from the accidental fall Thomas had described. The medical evidence supported her testimony, showing injuries consistent with a sustained assault, not a single tumble. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including the testimony of the nurses and the inconsistencies in his own story, Thomas could not escape justice. He was convicted of murder, kidnapping, and resisting an officer. The judge sentenced him to 18 years behind bars, closing the chapter on a horrific crime that began in a desert ranch and ended with the truth coming to light from the victim herself. See you next time. Thank you for following this intense story of justice and investigation. We hope you found the narrative compelling. Stay safe, and we will see you in the next video for another deep dive into true crime mysteries.